No stenosis, I would not touch it.
It seems built into my first personal perspective, but this is no proof. To use Spinoza's example, if the stone you threw acquired in mid-flight the kind of consciousness you enjoy, it might well thrillingly congratulate itself for its freely chosen trajectory, but you would know that its path was really necessitated by the laws of nature. So just having the subjective experience certainly doesn't show that we are actually free, at least if you think that there are some objective conditions that need to be satisfied for someone to be free, which I will say up front I am committed to. And also, like Spinoza, but without his certainty, I think there are serious reasons concerning human nature, the nature of the world, and our place in the world, that is, our relations to the rest of the world, to conclude that free will is an illusion, even if an explicable, subjectively inescapable illusion. The free will issue, viewed in historical perspective, is related to a cluster of philosophical issues. These include issues about, and this is more of an invitation for you to raise questions from any quarter in the 45 minutes after my presentation, even though naturally I'm just going to focus on a very limited range of these issues. So these issues include, 1, moral agency and responsibility, dignity, desert, accountability, and blameworthiness in ethics. Again, I italicized the last word in each of these clauses because it seems to me that whatever you say about free will have hefty implications for virtually every other field of philosophizing and ordinary reflective living. 2, the nature and limits of human freedom, autonomy, coercion, and control in social and political theory. Compulsion, addiction, self-control, self-deception, and weakness of will in philosophy and psychology. Criminal liability, responsibility, and punishment in legal theory. The relation of mind to body, consciousness, the nature of action and personhood in the philosophy of mind and the cognitive and neurosciences. The nature of rationality and rational choice in philosophy and social theory. Questions about divine foreknowledge, predestination, evil, and human freedom in theology and philosophy of religion. And finally, general metaphysical issues, which is more abstract and less interesting to people, but my favorite of all in a way, about necessity and possibility, determinism, time, chance, quantum reality, laws of nature, causality, and explanation in philosophy and the sciences. So again, I'm not going to be able, this is not me starting to ring in my internal mechanisms here, right? Okay? Yeah. So, I mean, if I really were doing a whole course with you on this, I would try to persuade you that if you hold this conception of free will, then among, for example, the a dozen or so philosophies of time that are on offer, you are committed to this one, or at least some subset that's compatible with your conception of free will, and so on, for topics that we don't even ordinarily think of when we're focusing just on the issue of free will. Some of these recurrent questions are conceptual, some ethical, some religious, some scientific, some metaphysical. How are such investigations to be integrated? So in other words, if really to get a sensitive, respectful account of free will, you should recognize its implications for all these different types of questions in all of these different fields. It's a pretty daunting task to try to come up with an adequate account. By focusing on 2 especially important concepts that have dominated the free will debate self-determination, and alternative possibilities, I will try to expose 25 minutes worth of deep tensions between optimists and pessimists about the nature, significance, and reality of free will. I will focus on these contested concepts, but I must say up front that one of the reasons I do and always have found the issue of free will so uniquely perplexing, why, to my personal unease, it is the only major issue in philosophy about which I have never been able to practice what I, albeit diffidently, preach. I've already recognized that I certainly act as if I have free will. In a certain sense, then, I believe I have free will. But as I've thought about this stuff for around 40 years, in another sense, I don't believe I have free will, or at least I'm deeply dubious about it. And the reason why it's so difficult is precisely because it does implicate such a wide-ranging cluster of related difficult issues. But there's another thing that makes it difficult for me in particular, namely what I'm going to call my metaphilosophy. There are lots of different metaphilosophies, that is, general approaches to the nature of philosophy, the methods that philosophy should use, the things that philosophy could, in principle, achieve, and what it can achieve, and so on and so forth. There's different varieties of philosophy as praxis, philosophy as phenomenology, philosophy as continuous with science, philosophy as linguistic analysis. By the way, not everyone, if I gave you a more exhaustive list, would necessarily be incompatible with one another. Sometimes you could use things in conjunction and so on. But these different approaches drive you, I think, to hold certain views. And I happen to hold the view that makes it most difficult for me to address this particular problem, because I'm a dinosaur, that is, I have the old-fashioned view, who thinks that philosophy should be systematic, as comprehensive as possible, worldview construction, right? To try to come up with a defensible, from a theoretical and practical point of view, account of everything, or every kind of thing, of a fundamental sort, how it all hangs together, blah, blah, blah. I'll do a few blah, blah, blahs, just like they used to do yada, yada, yada on Seinfeld. Again, just given my time constraints. Okay? The other thing about my own commitments, and I'm just stating them, I'm obviously not defending them now, is that not only do I have a certain metaphilosophical view, but I am also what's called technically in philosophy a non-reductionist in philosophy. That is, this is a very, very important distinction, I think, between different ways of doing philosophy. And so prima facie, now things, of course, eventually sometimes have to go into the dumpster after careful thought, but prima facie, everything, including various subjective appearances, should be somehow accommodated, somehow preserved. And indeed, if they can't be preserved, if they are determined, as best you can tell, to be illusions, then it seems to me desirable, if not incumbent upon a philosopher, to give a deep diagnosis as to why we have this illusion. That's itself an interesting philosophical question. And so, you know, you have eliminative materialists who say there's no such thing as consciousness. This is like nonsense as far as I'm concerned. But of course, that's not an argument. That's just hand-waving. I know I have some eliminativists in the audience, and so on. They can get at me later. But the point is, you know, there are some subjective phenomena that I will not relinquish. And yet, I'm very worried about one that seems as vital as any to so many issues, namely free will. Okay? So anyhow, I'm uncertain how to proceed to untie, rather than thoughtlessly cut, this thickest of all Gordian knots. What depends on what, as one seeks to construct a philosophy in which all deserving elements defensibly and beautifully hang together. To make matters still worse, soon I'll say something constructive, although actually skeptical, but it's constructive. But to make matters worse, and I guess the overarching skeptical thesis of this sketch, 45 years of studying the history of philosophy convinces me both that what a consistent philosopher says about free will depends on, in a very large way, his or her metaphilosophy, his or her view, again, about what philosophy is, what its proper method of inquiry is, and what it can and cannot achieve. And also, most specifically, and this is going to be something I'll talk about for around 5 minutes, it seems to me that there is no univocal sense of self, of determination, of alternative, and of possibility that satisfactorily organizes any stable view of what free will, and perhaps its frequent ethical cousin, moral responsibility, amount to. So here I have these two concepts. You know, if you have free will, you're self-determining, right? Nothing else is determining you and somehow bypassing you as the origination or source of the action and so on. Well, look, if we're taking seriously the notion of self-determination, then I would say at least a nominal level, almost, not all, but almost every philosopher who ever lived would be willing to start the discussion by saying, you know, this is part of what I mean by free will, self-determination. Well, what do you mean by the self? Well, again, if we had more time, and I'll give you a few examples soon, you know, there are immensely different, profoundly different conceptions of the self that I claim fall out of the different fundamental starting points of different philosophers and so on. And so they're bound to mean something different by self and health, hence self-determination, and hence free will. And the same, again, with concepts such as possibility and so on. Okay? Every proposal seems either to miss conditions that seem crucial or required conditions that are criticizable, sometimes even unintelligible to others. And lastly, if science is centrally relevant to the issue, because again, this is especially nowadays a pressing issue, right? How much of certain parts of the free will question, especially its existence, right? Maybe you think that you can come up with the concept on your own, although I'm challenging this. But if you want to know whether the concept can actually be instantiated in the real world, then you have to look at things that tell you what the real world is like. And so if it turns out that science, as it probably is essentially relevant to the issue, then could we even use reflection on our ways of thinking and talking to reliably guide our conceptualization of free will? Because in that case, even deeply unintuitive implications of our account shouldn't be deal breakers, since much of current basic science is strikingly unintuitive. I mean, you watch these things, Nova and so on TV, and they tell you the latest fundamental physics, cosmology and all. I mean, there's not a single thing they say that seems right to you, but this is what the mathematical equations entail, right? This is the way, at least the best explanation says. So, you know, even if you're not an intuition lover, usually you need to appeal to it at some stages, you know, with reflective equilibrium and so on. But who knows what the value of them are in cases like this. Okay, I'm now going to talk out the core of my presentation. I'll read some, but some of them stuff I'll just talk without reading, with portrayal of some of the elements of an action situation on the board in mind. So let me just actually read this to you, and then we'll go back to the text. So this is a kind of overly latitudinarian, perhaps, account of what a free action situation would look like. So in other words, if we were getting down to precise details, we might even be able to map on different conceptions of free will by saying, well, according to Hobbes, the only motivator is desire. There's no such separate thing as value. There's no such separate thing as reason that's not just desire and so on, right? So each philosopher is actually going to bump off some elements of this story, maybe say I didn't do enough and add something to the story. But anyhow, it's as robust enough a list to get the discussion started. So just to see where we're headed, and I'm making, again, contestable, right? I'm just starting off with presumptive but contestable claims that I, a person, okay, already, right? Am I a person? I mean, what does that mean exactly? And again, parentheses, allegedly equivalent, but maybe not. I mean, in fact, take something like person and self, right? I mean, etymologically, they're different, right? Persons from persona, it's like the masks people used to wear to present themselves to the word. Self comes from the Latin se, se, which is basically, you know, appropriate use of the word I, and so on. So, but anyhow, I'm obviously wanting to talk this way because I'm trying to get self-determination into the picture, okay? So I, a person or self, who is an agent? So claim again that if you're a person, one of the conditions on being a person is that you have some agency. No one who is a person lacks all agency, okay? With a certain character, I'm making a distinction. Right? C.A. Campbell, a lot of the libertarians did this early on and so on. You shouldn't identify the self with the character that you have. But again, other people, Hume perhaps, and we can talk about this later, think there is no such thing as the self that's separate. The only durable source of activity is what we call character, right? Those abiding dispositions and propensities, blah, blah, blah. Okay? So I, a person, an agent with a certain character, formed as I developed, and just trying to be realistic, right? I didn't self-create ab initio and stuff like this, right? I mean, I had formative influences and so on. In certain actual and perceived circumstances, right? Sometimes there are actual conditions that are relevant to your agency. Sometimes there's even falsely perceived circumstances. Having various, and again I'm being latitudinarian, reasons and or values and or desires. If we're going to talk about it as we go on, let's just, by stipulation for simplicity, call all of these kinds of things motives, okay? I want a separate term for the things that ostensibly temporally precede action, psychological states that temporally precede action and that causally contribute to the performance of that action, as opposed to certain other elements of the action situation that don't have the same place in the temporal sequence and so on. Okay. So we have all these reasons and so on, and then we choose, for now let's just say it's the same as decide, to form an intention. Some people think, why is this just like to use a lot of different words and so on and stuff? Oh, well, no. Actually, I myself think that you need intentions in addition to all this stuff to keep, so to speak, the plans going, so to speak. You can't just have, so to speak, a desire now to do things, right? Because sometimes you desire to graduate, summa cum laude in 4 years, right? It's not the desire that's sufficient to produce the outcome and so on. You have to have things which I think of as intentions and so on, which creates a purpose. So I'm treating for now purposes as contents of intentions. Again, see, this is the trouble with me, by the way. I just got to tell you right away. I'm going to stop, or I won't even get to page 3 and so on. But in other words, some people like Aristotle, might have a certain metaphysics or something of purposes in which they're, outside space and time, states of affairs that you believe don't exist, that you're trying to bring into existence through your action, right? Maybe, maybe not. I just wanted to say, whatever the metaphysics behind it, I do want to treat purposes as the content of intentions. So, what is your intention? Specify it for me. Distinguish it from other intentions. I say the purpose. Okay? To do something, finally. And then, circumstances permittingly, I perform an action which has certain consequences, intended and unintended sometimes. Okay? Now let me figure out where I am here and so on. Okay. Notice, by the way, as I suggest in brackets, will has not been mentioned yet. So if we're literally asking, do we have free will? Do we have, I deliberately, by the way, so I don't want to think I'm sloppy. In my first paragraph, if you read it at home, I shifted on purpose between choice and will. They're actually not the same, okay, in my view. In fact, in a certain way, I think in the end, will is the aggregate of character, motive, and purposes put together is the best way to think of it. But anyhow, this will be part of not the debate we'll have initially, but maybe eventually. Okay, so whether and if so, how this under or over describes the essential structure of free action is part of the debate. Okay. By the way, this is an open question, that is, whether you have free will, even if it's harder to have free will than we originally thought, or even if most of the time we don't have free will. Right? The question here is whether free will ever exists. And indeed, I think that even if we have free will, it's a much rarer occurrence than most people think. So just to say some very familiar, I think, well-established empirical things, you usually, for example, can't change your behavior simply by resolving to do so, right? Otherwise, New Year's resolutions would stick a lot better than they do, okay? That knowing what to do is not the same thing as being able to do it. Socratic intellectualism notwithstanding, okay? That you're a social being, mightily influenced by people around you, and the list could go on. So I'm just kind of gesturing toward increasing evidence in social science for how often, in fact, what we do habitually, often unconsciously, and rather rarely, for example, deliberatively and so on. Right? Just one plug, not for myself, but there are two very recent books, not philosophy books, that are extremely good on this point. One that just came out by a New York Times reporter named Charles Duhigg called The Power of Habit, and then one that came out around a year ago by David Brooks, The Social Animal, a very skillfully described research on these truths. Okay, so now we're going to get into more specific stages of the argument. The first thing I want to do is to distinguish different threats to free will. Okay? And the most general threat, this is an old canard, I mean, people have been using this for a long time, is the universal version of the argument for what's called hard determinism. Hard determinism is the view that determinism is universally true, and whatever is determined is not free, therefore everything is unfree. And so the argument goes more explicitly. Every event has a cause. Right away, some of you are going to say, this guy's living in the past. What about quantum mechanics, right? Quantum indeterminacy and all. I don't even want to argue about it, at least up front. Suppose it's true. It certainly doesn't follow that anything we're concerned about, macro events, like whether I'm raising my arm freely, whether my psychological states preceding my raising my arm are free, and so on. So it certainly has not been established that there are undetermined macro events and so on, right? In fact, as it turns out, there have to be lots of conditions that are satisfied for micro indeterminacy to have any effect in the macro world, what they call certain amplifications and so on. People bring in chaos theory, they bring in all this kind of stuff nowadays and all. Anyhow, the general version is every at least macro event has a cause. Human choices and actions are events. Therefore, human actions and causes and choices are caused. Whatever is caused is unfree. Therefore, human actions and choices are all, one and all, unfree. But there are, if you don't like that kind of universal threat, what I think in the end is somewhat more interesting, specific types of threats to free will. And to mention 3 or 4 of the more prominent ones, there's theological determinism. We have some people here visiting happily from a nearby seminary and so on. So they should certainly help us out in discussion and so on. There are obviously different sources of theological worries. Maybe stronger ones have to do with predestination. And indeed, some people want to conclude that there is no free will. There are ones having to do with divine knowledge. This is interesting, just very quickly, since we won't have a chance initially to really talk much about any of these things. God is typically thought to be omniscient. Some people want to insist that he's omniscient in the sense of foreknowing. And if you mean foreknowing, that is knows in advance in time, so that in some sense God is in time, that produces certain other special problems, right? So certain kinds of solutions, like the Thomistic solution, in which God is outside of time and maybe synoptically looks at the entire universe, which just means his own intention, so to speak, of what he wanted to create. Why should that sort of spectatorial vision somehow make you do something, right? I mean, he just sees that, in effect, to put it glibly, you did it freely this time, and this other time you didn't do it freely. Whereas you could see how if God is, as many people insist he must be, even given Scripture and so on, in time and foreknows, that's a different story. Then you have to figure out different ways of trying to exonerate God from, in the Milton thing, not having free will and all. Again, in anticipation, if anybody wants to talk about it, I actually think if you're going to hold that view, the best solution is the one by the Molinists and so on, okay? Anyhow, I actually don't think there's a problem with theological determinism. I think there are good answers to that problem. So this is not why I'm a worrywart when it comes to the problem, okay? Physical determinism, there are special versions of it. You could just think of an instance of the general determinism and all. Usually the versions are formulated a little bit differently, such that, for example, you can't change the past and the laws of nature, by which they mean the laws of physical nature. These are people now who are physicalists and a certain kind of naturalists and so on. And so since what you're doing now is a function of the past and the laws of nature, you can't change what you're doing now. You couldn't have done otherwise, no free will and so on. There's logical determinism, another one that I actually think is not that serious. There's different forms of logical determinism. Sometimes people just appeal to what they call the law of excluded middle, right? That is, for every proposition whatsoever, I have to add to be explicit, about the past, present, or future, right? Any proposition whatsoever, it has to be either true or false. So if it's now true, this is like Aristotle's De Interpretatione 9, right, about the sea battle. If it's now true that there will be a sea battle tomorrow, then nothing that the generals could do today is going to change that outcome, kind of thing, you know. This is a good example, by the way, and I swear now I'll cut this is a very good example of how you have to bring in the philosophy of time, right? Because obviously if you have a philosophy of time, to take the most easiest, you know, exaggerated case, called presentism, which only the present, the things in the present exist. And literally, there is no future. It may be a certain perspectival way of talking or something, but there is no part of reality called the future, then this is not a problem for you. On the other hand, physicists who talk about four-dimensional block universes think you're just a darn prejudicial person if you think that the present is any better off reality-wise than the past or the future. They're all equally real and so on. So here's a good example of the many examples I could give of how you get into these other issues. Let's see, I'm already 20 minutes in. I'm going to, in 2 seconds, abandon the entire thing and do my compressed version and all. At least you could think that I would have said good things if I had the opportunity. Okay. Anyhow, you can read all these different kinds of views, and indeed I'm going to skip something so I could say something much more unusual that is much more controversial and the result of my own work and efforts and not just things that you could find in other sources and so on. But I do want, if you're at all interested in thinking about this on your own, to look at the stuff I'm skipping in the next page or so, because it is, I think, important if you're going to really worry about the issue, and not to be a logic shopper, but to make certain kinds of distinctions, and especially with regard to the different forms of what's called libertarianism. Libertarianism, as a thesis about free will, is the view that we do have free will. It's incompatibilist. You couldn't have free will if everything was sufficiently causally determined, and so it must be the case that in some ways indeterminism, which doesn't mean, they claim, utter chance, utter randomness, utter arbitrariness and so on, has to play some role in the free action situation. And then you get into all these debates that are very important, I think, as to where you might insert that indeterminism in order for you to have an acceptable concept of free will. And the reason, again, generally, why it's important where you insert it is that it does seem as if you need some kind of control to say that you have freedom, right? If things just haphazardly happen and you're not in any way, even in a modest way, in control, it pretty clearly seems to follow to me that you don't have a free will. So you need control. You also need some degree of stability, right? I mean, in order to have free will and so on. People who are total lovers of stability are the ones who think all that matters is character. If you're acting according to your character in a totally deterministic way, that's all you would ever want to say and so on. So what I want to do is 2 things. And again, I'm going to literally, I hope I do it okay. I'll leave the script entirely now. I just want to give you the flavor in 2 different ways of how it is that one's philosophical method and metaphilosophy generally virtually dictates what you can end up saying about other issues too, but about free will. And 2, how in particular, again, just as an illustration of a more general point, how it is that people with different philosophical approaches literally mean different things by self-determination, and hence are not really, if I may put it bluntly, arguing about the very same thing. Okay? So let me go through 2 types of examples. The first is to just start off with Hobbes, who just historically, I think, in modern times, you know, in, 1651, when he published the Leviathan, basically argued that ordinary freedoms that we prize in everyday life, right, freedom from coercion, things that include political and economic freedoms and all, are the only freedoms that make any sense, the only freedoms that are really worth having and so on. And this traditional old-fashioned notion of free will, which is a much more robust notion, was in fact unintelligible. And so Hobbes had the following view, and again, especially you got Hobbes specialists and so on here, so I'm doing my slightly bastardized version of everything here, but I hope not too misleading or anything. So Hobbes' view basically is you are free, he wouldn't say free will, but you are free in the only sense in which there is freedom if you do what you want to do without impediment or coercion. And indeed, since want, or motive, to use the umbrella term here, covers all your internal states, basically, and this is how I read Aristotle, by the way, in Nicomachean Ethics, in his account of voluntariness, the only condition under which you're not free is if something external to you prevents you from doing something. In other words, if the world doesn't cooperate for you. Right? So, even if you had a very, very dastardly set of parents and so on, they screwed you up a little bit and so on and so forth, doesn't matter. You are what you are now. If right now you do what you want with that character and so on, you're free. On the other hand, to use the Humean example, if you're chained to something in a prison, you're not free. Okay? And there was a very interesting debate between Hobbes and a guy named John Bramhall that went on up and back for around a decade and so on. And Bramhall is historically, in modern times, the formative proponent of libertarianism, of strong free will kind of theories and so on. Okay? Now, why am I putting it this way? Because to even frame not the problem of free will, but one way of looking at the problem of free will that I'm framing it now, I'm already using a certain notion of causation, namely the modern rise of modern science. Only good kind of explanatory causation is efficient causation, right? I mean, if you go back to Aristotle and so on, you have, right, the four causes. You have formal cause. You have especially final cause and so on. And so in a way, we're bypassing those possibilities, okay? That would be another stage of the argument that I'm just leaving and so on. Okay, so let me get to the interesting things. I'll try to do it in 5, 6, or 7 minutes, and then I'll stop. Again, this is why I always, my friends and colleagues know this about me, no matter what. I mean, I did something at the workshop, social and political thought workshop, just supposed to respond something on Hume, and I gave a 12-page handout, because I know, just it's a guilty conscience. I mean, okay, so go through a few examples in my kind of quick way. Let's go to Locke. Locke is an empiricist like Hobbes. Nevertheless, Locke had very powerful philosophical reasons to make a distinction between the voluntary and the free. He thought that Hobbes had given an adequate account of voluntary action, doing what you want to do, or if you want to talk that way, doing what you volit, volitional action and so on. But that in order to be free, a second necessary condition had to be satisfied. You have to have been able to do otherwise, right? He gives this famous example of a man, he says, who while asleep is transported into a room that's locked behind him. The guy wakes up. Let's just suppose that he's not freaked out by what just happened to him. And he says, oh, there's my best long-lost friend, John. Should I stay or leave? Well, I like to talk to John. I'm going to stay. He stays. He does what he wants to do. He is a voluntary agent, but according to Locke, he's not a free agent. And then we get all these questions about whether that second condition needs to be satisfied in order for him to be morally responsible for the action in question. And this is one of the two, I think, probably maybe most dubious, but I'm just reporting my views, thing to say. But Locke is unique in all the people that I teach, for example, in 17th and 18th century philosophy, because I actually think that Locke is not only anti-metaphysical, which Hume is also, but he is like a proto-pragmatist. That is, Locke is trying to develop conceptions of liberty, of personhood and personal identity in those famous discussions and so on. Basically to say, what would a proper society look like, right? Would a proper society, for example, punish insane people? No. I'd better conceive agency in a certain way so that we're not going to punish insane people, right? And then, of course, you get into the details. Well, what if you're not just severely mentally ill? What if you just kind of freaked out by things and so are afraid and so cave in early when someone says, you know, so-and-so of your life, where the so-and-so is not a gun to your head, but some little thing, you know what I mean? Anyhow, the general point I'm making, and I'm going to be much more specific in two other examples, is that Locke began a very interesting trend that has a certain trajectory. He said, everything you said so far, Hobbes, is right. Freedom does require it, but freedom requires more. And he added, could have done otherwise. But like all those early classical compatibilists, he had a very thin notion of could have done otherwise. And he had to have a thin notion of could have done otherwise because he was a determinist, right? Namely, he thought, and here's where we get into the alternative possibility stuff, that is, when you say, I could have done otherwise, all you're saying is you would have done otherwise if, in fact, you had chosen otherwise, and so on, right? So it's a wholly conditional analysis. You're not actually saying, in other words, to put it intuitively, that categorically, here and now, I could have branched out this way rather than that way. No, if determinism is true, then the temporal history of the universe is linear, right? It's not forking all over the place and so on, right? And so he had this very minimalist conception of could have done otherwise. And then what's been happening through all the debates in the 20th century is people say things like, well, all this is right. Locke, you're a little better than Hobbes was and so on. But this is not an account of freedom of the will, certainly, right? You know, as Frankfurt and others put it, this may be free action, but not freedom of the will. It has to be, even to be a person in Frankfurt's case, that you not only have desires, but you can somehow reflect on those desires. You can have second-order desires, and then you go through all these transformations and so on. Anyhow, the trend I'm just trying to show you on the empiricist compatibilist tradition is toward ever additional conditions on free will. And then they get to a point in which if they added one more thing, they would be indeterminists. They would be libertarians and so on. And of course, this is where they dig in their heels. Now, I'm going to give you, and I do want to say one different kind of thing, so let me just say this quickly. Okay, so let me just give you one radically different type of example, and I'll leave all the others out. And if you want to call me and talk to me on the phone about this, feel free, once I get a good night's sleep, so sometime next week and so on, okay? Take Spinoza, okay? In fact, I'll do it even more quickly. Spinoza stoutly denies free will, yet he thinks that there's such a thing as freedom that comes in grades, in degrees and so on. You can be more or less free. And he has this elaborate, wonderful system showing that the more active you are, the more free you are, the more happy you are, the more virtuous you are, and all these wonderful equivalences. But he is, one, a strong rationalist. Everything's supposed to be explained by the principle of sufficient reason. To put it bluntly, if you ask Spinoza, what is your true self, the optimal self, this is Descartes too, the true self is the rational self. So insofar as what's determining your action is rationality, you're more a self, so to speak. Insofar as it's a passion, you're less of a self, and so on and so forth. And so his conception of freedom as self-determination, which is the official definition, by the way, straight out in the definitions and so on, is going to be of a certain sort. Take Hume. What is Hume, in this regard, most famous for? Hume is famous for basically, among other things, trying to diminish our love of reason, our admiration for reason. He doesn't deny that there's such a thing as reason, but he thinks that it's a much more puny, and in some cases even impotent thing, that other people think that there is. So in one sense, he's not a metaphysician. He doesn't have a metaphysics of the self, but roughly his conception of the self is a complicated one that's rooted in the notions of passion and imagination. So just as a guy like Spinoza spurns the passions, right? Hume thinks that this is the only source of motivation even. This is who we are. And why is it the case? And I haven't had an opportunity as well. Because Hume, and here's my main point now, and then I'll say one last thing and I'll stop. Because if you look at the whole way they proceed in proper philosophical inquiry, read the Ethics. What happens? You start with a priori metaphysics, part one. You deduce from a priori metaphysics an account of human nature, because we're interested in what we're going to do, right? That includes a theory of knowledge and a theory of the emotions. Once you understand human nature, you know how you should live well, right? That is, to live well depends upon what kind of person you are, and what kind of person you are depends upon your place in the correctly described metaphysical scheme. So metaphysics, theory of human nature and theory of emotions, ethics at the end. That's exactly the way the book comes out and so on, right? Hume, we got to start with a theory of human nature, not with a metaphysics. In fact, poo-poo metaphysics, bad altogether and so on. And a theory of human nature can't be a priori. It's a purely empirical enterprise and so on, right? You get a whole different result and all. And this is the pattern. This is in the book, actually, among other things, if you ever want to look at it. This, by the way, totally not an advertisement. I'd blush to the hilt if I ever advertised anything on behalf of myself. So now, the claims, at least, I'll leave it for questions. So the claims that I want to focus on then is, one, there is no such thing as a univocal, stable conception of the self. And I just want to even add, in a cursory way, the fact that we now have increasing empirical evidence for this claim. So if, for example, you ask people, does cognitive science, which basically treats human activity as a series of psychological states and processes, which are in turn caused by prior states and processes and so on. Right? One model would be like artificial intelligence, right? That it will like sort of a computer, you know, and so on and so forth. You ask people, do you think that cognitive science is a threat to free will? You cannot get the univocal answer from people. It depends upon how you focus the question in on them. If you sort of zoom in and show them all this gory detail of cognitive science, they say, oh, big threat to free will. If you think of the self in a broader context and so on, with the same information from cognitive science, they say, no problem, the agent did it. So again, you have psychological conceptions of the self. You have bodily conceptions of the self. You have what's sometimes called the executive conception of the self, as with the agent causal libertarians, where you are you, the self, who has all these states, bodily and physical and so on. And it turns out that we can't even get a single conception that way. And the same with how you proceed philosophically. Okay, well, in my usual meandering self, few people love it, most don't like it. So let me just read my last paragraph, having skipped half the paper I was supposed to read, and just say that I should thank Robert Talisse for scheduling my public doubts about free will today on the Ides of March, the day Julius Caesar was stabbed to death in the Roman Senate by a group of conspirators, as foreseen, according to Plutarch, by a soothsayer. Perhaps now, and I didn't realize I'd need this line so badly, but I'm glad I wrote it now, perhaps now I can escape intellectual blame by invoking fate. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so as usual, professors last, advanced graduate students in the philosophy department next to last, everybody else urgently welcome. And again, in a way, the fact that there are so many gaps is a good invitation. Right? And I listed all these different issues and spoke about precious little of them. So. Except for some of the stuff in legal theory, which I haven't really thought about much. I have something to say about all of it. Okay, who had the hand? Oh, okay, yeah, hi.
Remind me, Professor,
yeah.
What was the first book reference you mentioned, the New York Times column, Robert
Duhigg, his name is, D-U-H-I-G-G.
And what was the book?
The name of the book is The Power of Habit. Yeah. See, why'd you rush me? Yeah. Okay. I'll give you 15 more seconds before my colleague David Wood. Okay, again.
Well, I have a preliminary question, which is, do you have a gun hidden on the podium? No, just a clarificatory question.
Given the exact character of your question, I think I refuse to answer.
I
if you asked me, you know, if I had a napkin or something, I would certainly come clean right away. But you know, I'm a peaceable guy.
My direct question is, what have you been doing to us? What have you been trying to do to us? Have you been browbeating us?
Oh no,
No.
that's definitely not the case.
Well, in that case, I think that arguments, it strikes me, and I really like your comment on this, arguments against free will are performatively self-contradictory in the following way. You're giving us reasons to accept your position.
Right.
And in giving us reasons, you're calling on us to assent or not to assent to the reasons you've given.
Right.
And it seems to me that you are unavoidably committed as a speaker to free will. Even so far,
Yeah,
this is my
yeah.
suggestion. And if you say no, because giving reasons and responding could all be causal.
That's right.
Then I want to know if there's any real distinction in principle between your trying to persuade us
Right.
and you're pulling out your gun
Right.
and
Right.
saying you agree or else.
By the way, let me just say one more important thing first, and then I'll try to answer the question directly. Who knows, again, when I start talking spontaneously, what actually came out of my mouth. But it's certainly not my position to even argue that we don't have free will. That is not my position. In fact, it's in my document, if you read the third appendix. Well, because, no, what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to be straight-faced about this for a second here, okay? That is, the reason why I chose for the first time, and I'm only using the words advisedly, to do a seminar, as I'm currently doing, on free will and values, is that I really have been thinking about this stuff for a long time. I am unconvinced about the adequacy of different accounts. As I say, in a certain sense, I'm almost honoring what you're saying in terms of how I act myself. I don't like the feeling, I don't want to be overly earnest, of having such a cognitive and connotative sort of dissonance of, you know, so being so committed to something that the arguments suggest to me either go against or cause me to doubt and so on and so forth. And so the position that has always really tempted me, which I basically just outlined in that third appendix, is Kant's position. And so I'll just say this much even now. Kant's position, and he makes all these distinctions between transcendental freedom and positive freedom and practical freedom and autonomy and so on. But the structure of his own response is, I'm going to actually show you that people who think free will is impossible are wrong. Okay? That is, free will is logically possible. Okay? The question is, since he rightly makes a distinction between logical possibility and a richer sense of possibility, namely metaphysical possibility, possibility as a condition for experience and so on, the question is whether it's metaphysically possible. And his position roughly ends up being that we can't know whether it's metaphysically possible, so that a skeptic who doubts it is not epistemically irrational. But, and here, as you know, as someone who reads Kant, he holds a stronger position in Critique of Practical Reason in places later than in the Critique of Pure Reason. But the main position that I'm focusing on from the Critique of Pure Reason and so on is that there is another cognitive attitude, if you want to call it that. Let's call it belief, right? Which, when considered practically, and even let me just put it, you know, now flat-footedly in terms of having the belief itself would produce some vital good, so to speak, that you wouldn't get otherwise and so on. In that sense, free will is practically correctly believed. Now look, just to try to cut to the chase, the reason why I don't want to jump on the bandwagon and so on, and again, you know, especially if people know Kant, I'm skipping a lot of steps, but what is the main good that presupposes the strong kind of free will, right? Not just compatibilist free action that we're talking about. The main good is that it's a necessary condition for ought judgments. Okay? Now again, if you are committed, and this is why I didn't stress this enough. See, the reason why my course is called Free Will and Values is that I used to think free will was an isolatably metaphysical issue. Now I think this is completely wrong. That is, no account even of free will is value neutral. It's the value embedded and so on. So if someone said to me, here's my ethics, this is a good ethics, this ethics requires this account of free will, we know for sure that some people are going to respond, good riddance with that account of ethics, right? You know, to take the most extreme, obvious other case, we shouldn't have any kind of backward-looking, retributive notions in our ethics, say, right? We should just be forward-looking and try to treat criminality and sin and so on in the way we would treat a sick person and treat them, you know, and have a more forward-looking view, like you would actually find if we could elaborate on people like Hume and so on, right? So these are all conditional claims to me, is my point. In other words, if you said, Tlumak, how could you consistently hold a full-blooded Kantian ethics and performatively do the kind of thing you're doing? I'd say you got me and all. But I'm at sea with the relations between all these issues, if you see what I mean. You know?
Just one point of clarification,
Yeah.
to follow up, and then I'll stop. Do you agree that philosophical discussion and argument presupposes free will? That's the heart of what I was starting with.
Well, I'm not sure how to answer that question, again, because of all the distinctions I want to make. By the way, you know, this particular argument, I mean, in the Review of Metaphysics, right, if you recall back in the 60s and 70s, I mean, every year they had another article about exactly this conclusion and so on. So I understand the challenge and so on. I don't know. If you're asking me, do I, in the way committedly, as a person and professionally, behave as if it's true? The answer is yes.
No, I'm not talking about your personal. I'm talking logically about whether engaging in a philosophical argument presupposes the capacity for free assent on the part of the other.
Well, no, I don't think that's clear. No, I don't think that's true. Right. And indeed, you know, there are, again, this is not, there are people who, of course, think that reason is, and this is the point you began with, a bludgeon, no different in kind than a gun. Some people intimidate by guns and others by reason. But the thing I want to stress, and I know it sounds like a cop-out, but I'm just trying to be honest about it, is that I find all this stuff just so perplexing. It's not like, in other words, there's a vulnerability in giving a talk like this, because my official position is I'm not sure what to say. Indeed, even in the, no, seriously, even in the sense of when you say, do you have free will? And then I go back, if I could do it now for an hour, and say, here are, and I'm not making up numbers, I'm like 10 different senses of self-determination. Well, maybe in sense 1 and 2, for sure, you know. As you get more and more robust, it's just not clear to me anymore, you know what I mean? But it's a worry, I mean, and that's what skepticism is. You worry about all these things, and you're not so, you know, cocksure about any of them. Yeah, Jessica.
So here's a way to perhaps think about this question of performativity in a way that might, you know, make it more specific to how it would have an impact for the methodology of asking this question. So if you ask the question in the form of, do we have free will or do we not have free will, do you think it's possible to take into account the way that language always already seems to prefigure or presuppose an answer to this question? And to give an example, in your third paragraph, you use the phrase, there are weighty moral, religious, and deeply personal reasons for wanting free will. So emphasis on wanting. And then as well, later on in that paragraph, I can't help but act as if. So interesting juxtaposition between I can't help and the acting. So I'm asking whether you think it's important for, you know, a philosopher's methodology, a philosopher who's concerned with this question about free will versus determinism in that form, whether it's necessary for the philosopher to take account of these kind of linguistic phenomena that I just referenced, or whether they are, you think that they're merely accidental or incidental to that it's just a kind of limitation that is peripheral to the way that the philosopher should proceed.
Right. Let me say one prefatory thing and then try to address it directly. I mentioned at the beginning, near the beginning, that I am what I called non-reductivist. When we did the pro seminar this past fall, we actually read Thomas Nagel's Subjective and Objective, Rob Talisse and I. And I was pushing the idea that I think is accurate, even descriptively, that an enormous number of perennial philosophical problems are explicable exactly because there is an irreconcilable tension between a certain subjective perspective on the issue and a certain objective perspective. And of course, there are lots of people, given their metaphilosophical approach, who say reality is objective reality, get rid of the subjective, solve the problem. I'm not prepared to do that. And so this is why I have a lot of the worries. They are all, and indeed, just for the record, Nagel's own view is that a lot of these problems are actually, and this is going to be a segue to the linguistic part, are currently irresolvable. The only way we could resolve some of these problems, and this can happen, is if we basically acquire new concepts that we don't have now. And right, this happens, right? You had a certain conception of even matter. You have Clerk Maxwell with electromagnetic theory. You have a different conception of matter and energy. You have Einstein. All this stuff changes and all, right? So maybe by developing new concepts, you could break a certain logjam. So in general, and I'm trying to bring both questions back together again, there are a lot of things that, again, I want to repeat. I act as if, I can't help but, I even say from the subjective perspective, this is what makes the problem for me. Now, I happen, and it just sounds like I'm holding forth there, I happen to have kind of graded commitments to what kinds of subjective phenomena are important to preserve because I'm a systematic philosopher. I don't think there's any isolatable issue that I would ever, in a kind of utterly confident, conclusive way, say, this is a touchstone, I got to say this. I'm always saying, oh, Jesus, if I say this over here, then I'm going to have to say these two other things over there. I could live with that, If I say this, I got to say other things. I can't live with that. And then maybe I got to go back and say, well, I better live with it because the alternative is even worse and so on. So this is what makes it so complicated. Now, I happen, and I said I was a dinosaur. This is going to be another example of why I'm a dinosaur. I happen to think linguistic phenomena, and what I mentioned as linguistic philosophy, is the least interesting of all. I even think, by the way, increasing psychological evidence shows that, and I want to be careful because even Locke realized this, by the way, that fundamental thought precedes language. Right? Thought precedes language in terms of fundamental language use and so on. Now, it is true that there are certain thoughts that a human being cannot have unless they have some kind of symbol system, like a linguistic system. And one especially interesting example of this in Locke is his view about persons and personal identity. We're talking about selves and so on. That is, Locke thinks that, as we, if anybody's read Locke, that, to put it again very quickly, that you have to understand persistence of the person through time in terms of, as he says, extendability of consciousness backwards. Or let's just say, in principle, ability to to remember something. Could you remember what X person did previously and so on? Okay? So persons are understood in terms of memory, and this is an empirical claim, he's an empiricist, and you couldn't have the required long-term memory unless you had language. People without language don't have that kind of potentiality to have extended consciousness in that way and so on. So now, of course, when I say linguistic philosophy, I was trained in analytic philosophy. I read all these, philosophy of language type, approaches and so on. And some of them just seem to me quite uninteresting even. I mean, this is the way we talk. I mean, most of this stuff is conventional as far as I'm concerned. It doesn't show anything interesting and so on. But at certain levels, so now I'm being my equi-balanced kind of self again, for certain issues, I would take linguistic phenomena more seriously, namely, just what I said, exactly when the linguistic phenomena is somehow essential to the subject matter. But in most cases, I'm not only not committed to preserving the linguistic phenomena, but as I said, even the way I would try to, on my own view, conceptualize something You know, it may be that the way the world is makes it seem, you know, quite different from the way I thought about it. I mean, so yeah, Mark, this is a student from what, the late 19th? Yeah.
I appreciate you mentioning Molinism. We talked about that in seminary, and I think you said you were warmly disposed toward it. I mean, one version we talked about it has a certain character determinism, and that instead of God seeing the future and locking it in, he can do the math and know how you end up. So are you comfortable with that sort of character determinism?
Well, let me just say two things. Remember I said that there are two different ways, at least two different ways to understand divine knowledge. There is and it's related to two different conceptions of God's eternality. Eternality as atemporality, outside of time. Eternality as everlastingness, no beginning and no end. Now, I, like a lot of philosophers, are often accused of being someone who believes in the God of the philosophers and not the God of religion. I myself conceive of God in the atemporal way. I think there are immensely greater advantages. So I don't think I need a Molinist solution. I think there are easier solutions, like the Thomistic ones, even like Augustinian ones, and so on and so forth. But if I were wondering about the problem of foreknowledge in a literal sense, then it seems to me the best route is Molinism. And the point is, and maybe I just don't understand it well enough, it's not just a clumsy kind of compatibilism, because then you do get the problem that the ultimate source, the originary cause, is God, and so why not blame him and so on, right? On the other hand, you got to have him, with respect to all truths, know that they're true, infallibly believe that they're true, and so on and so forth. And so, you know, and this gets into other technical issues, because Molinism, as I understand it, involves, for example, appeal to certain counterfactual knowledge that God has. And as we know, whole books are written on how to understand counterfactuals. I mean, so yes, that would, as I understand it, be almost the only way to go to get out of the problem of foreknowledge. Yeah, Rob.
So a question of clarification, because it sounded to me like you drew a weaker conclusion from something that you said at the end than the one that I thought one should draw. So what was the conclusion that follows from the claim that there's no univocal conception of the self?
Well, the univocal conclusion, I mean, there's a guy, Richard Double, who writes on this stuff. He usefully uses the notion of an umbrella term, you know. Free will is an umbrella term at this point. I mean, it's covered so many different kinds of disputes that you always have to make sure you're not talking at cross purposes when you talk to anybody about it. So now if you're saying, what is my conclusion, and you wanted me to draw a stronger conclusion, partly because of that commitment that there is no free will, I don't know how I could do that yet. It seems that would be precipitous to me, because if I don't know stably what I'm asking when I say about free will in a non-conditional way, right? So again, just to give one other example, there's a guy, Dirk Perboom, you know, who I met at this conference and all. He thinks, yes, certain backward-looking retributive conceptions, moral responsibility in the sense of legitimate ascriptions of praise and blameworthiness, you know, that would require a certain kind of free will that most people find inadequate. And that's, by the way, another, I should get a laugh at this, another appendix, go through some of these views and gives the main objections to those views and so on, right? But if in the end we say, okay, here's one conception, it's instantiatable, and it allows you to do X, and that's all I care about for current discussion, then that's okay with me.
But doesn't it strike you that any position in this debate requires there to be a univocal conception of the self? That if there isn't one, maybe we should just be eliminativists about the issue?
Well, if you think that it's a precondition of there being a meaningful debate, that there be a univocal notion. But of course...
Just a sentence up there. It looks as if the free willist is going to say, yes, that's sometimes true of some subject named by I, and the determinist says that's never true of any subject named by the I, but both need there to be a univocal conception of I, who can be a person or a self, an agent. And if we're saying that there isn't such a thing, then we should say that sentence is never true, but that's not determinism. That's just some other kind of view that says that this is not an issue that's formulable in a meaningful way.
Well, let me ask you a question just to make sure I understand, because I actually don't get the full force of it yet. I said that every element of these two crucial notions, and others as well, self, determination, alternative possibilities, are infected in this worrisome way. Let's look just for 1 second at the determination part, okay? Now, how does Hume so confidently say that he can reconcile freedom and necessity, that is causality? Because he famously gives a conception of causality that is a deflated conception of causality. That is, he's trying to convince us that when you say that A causes B, you would be quite mistaken to think that A is somehow forcing someone to do something, bypassing its own activity, and so on and so forth, right? And I actually think Hume is right, that if we conceive of determination that weaker way, then his whole argument goes through. I'm not convinced that that's a robust enough conception of causality. So now just using that as an illustration, because I'm missing the point, I'm trying to have sub-discussions here in a way, you know what I mean? Why is the fact that you can't have a single arena of discussion a sufficient reason to say that the answer to that is no? Is that what you want to conclude? The answer to that has to be no, if there can't be this kind of consensus? I just don't understand how that follows.
Both positions require there to be a consensus of one form or another on what the self is. But if there is no univocal conception of the self, maybe we should just think that talk of selves is like, you know, what people in the 1800s were talking about when they were talking about witches. Just fictions that we've now gotten over. And that's not a case for determinism. That's a case for thinking the debate is philosophically...
Yeah, but again, this seems to me precipitous in the sense that, by the way, I am an eliminativist with regard to witches and so on. Sure, there are conditions under which we should get rid of things. But I mean, it sounds to me, given my own positions, if I could really sustain them, that there would be no discussions about anything. I mean, I want to say this about almost any philosophical topic you're talking about. I mean, and that seems to me too strong and quick a move and so on. I mean.
Okay, maybe one other question over there, Joe.
Yeah.
Okay, so you spend a bunch of time sort of laying out how certain people's systems were built, like sort of what, you know, what drives what, and particularly sort of what's driving their account of free will. And I wonder if you actually think there's a proper way to build a system, and the role, is it that starting at free will could be better, or is the right way to build a system, or if it doesn't matter, you just have to know everything that has to be in your system that has to
Yeah, and this is the most important question and why I love my field of modern philosophy so much, because during this period, this 160-year period or so, people, one by one, tremendously good thinkers, explicitly had front and center the issue of how you proceed in proper inquiry and so on. And here's my quick answer. There's one philosopher only who procedurally, as far as it goes, seems 100% right. Kant. That's why I'm a Kantian. But one reason why he's able to be right is that as much as people think in ethics and all these other fields, he's some overreaching rigorist and all, I think this is a complete misunderstanding. Kant is the most modest philosopher of all time. That is, Kant is trying to show a few fundamental preconditions for all sorts of things, not trying to establish axioms which would be sufficient to deduce all these determinate truths about this or that, right? So given the modesty of the project, albeit an enormously important project and so on, he's exactly on the right track. So he gets a clean bill of health from me, okay? Now, with respect to virtually every other non-transcendental philosopher who says, I'm the innovator, this is the way to go, a plague on all your other houses, Descartes realized, this is the greatest virtue of Descartes, that none of these people should be taken seriously in a way, because what they're doing is always violating the problem of the criterion. That is, they're always starting off with certain starting points, which you can tell in 5 seconds 10 of their opponents are going to say, this is a crazy starting point. Of course, if I accept this starting point, the jig is up, you know what I mean? But it's exactly my view to reject this kind of thing and so on, right? And so, you know, I happen to be teaching Spinoza's ethics right now. Now, again, I treat the definitions and the axioms more subtly eventually. But at first blush, he defines all these things. And I say to the students, definition 2, contrary to Descartes. Definition 4, contrary. He's supposed to be refuting Descartes by begging every question against him and so on. So that's why I talk about skepticism so much. I mean, I wrote my dissertation on skepticism all my life. I've been interested in skepticism because in a certain sense, that's the best position once you get the few apodictic certainties that you get in Kant, you know what I mean? Now, it turns out that there are a few things that you can actually get substantively, existentially, and so on from radical doubt. I believe the cogito actually works and so on, just the easiest case and so on, right? So anything you can get under conditions that in effect are neutralizing, right, where you're not assuming anything and violating the problem of the criterion would be a good way to go and so on. But also, there are grades of justifications, that are grades of believability, however you want to say it. So I basically say, look, okay, so here's the absolutely good stuff. You know, put it in your pocket. You don't have to worry about it ever again. But I'll talk about the other things. And in some cases, I even revert, like Talisse would want me to perhaps, to philosophy is continuous with science, right? There are certain kinds of issues that I have a completely fallibilistic, what's the best current explanation kind of view on, because it's simply not subject to any of the traditional philosophical methodologies and stuff, you know what I mean? So I have on the one hand, systematic worldview, but not homogeneously systematic. I got layers. And I even have, to say just one last thing, the same substantive views about particular issues like ethics and all. Because I think that there are different stringencies to duties. Some are absolutely inviolable. Some are prima facie and strong, and so on and so forth. Okay, sorry.
Okay, so I think we should thank Jeffrey. Beforehand, I'll just remind you that we have one more of these sessions to go. That's next week, and our colleague Marilyn Friedman will be talking about whether that is happy. Is that good? Good. And fitting end to all this, since all of you are bad people. Anyway, so you want to know whether you're justified being happy or not, and we'll find out about that as well. But thank Jeffrey for sure.
At higher risk for sudden cardiac death, which again